right? So after the World War II, there was significant social political change. One serious problem is reconstruction. World War II brought so much destruction to cities. So there was a need to build quickly, reconstruct quickly. It was not practical. Even people want to continue the kind of neoclassicism in architectural design. It was not practical at all. So one needs to build fast, reconstruct the city fast, and industrialization is the solution, right? So if those modernism before 1945 was some minority kind of experiment in architecture, then after World War II, it became necessary to build in those straightforward rectangular shape without decoration, using industrial material, using industrial process in architecture, because they need to build fast. They need to provide housing to large amount of people whose home had been damaged or destroyed during the war. Right? So it is truly after 1945, modernism became the mainstream. So if you look at those architecture built before 1945, even though today in architectural history, we highlight those experiments by Corbusier, by Mies and Gropius, but before 1945, their buildings are small, insignificant, and minority. They were the majority of high-profile buildings were still constructed in neoclassical style. But after 1945, large-scale architectural projects were constructed in the modernist style of simplicity. That destruction made that necessary. So this is, what it looked like for a city just after 1945. A whole city needed to be reconstructed. How do you do that? Like the cathedral? No way. That would take century to build. There's no way to reconstruct the city, continuing that revival or historicism. Right? So Le Corbusier's Unité de Habitation in Marseille was one of those large residential projects built in modernist style. It's clean. It is without decoration. At the same time, it fully realized Le Corbusier's architectural ideal. So it had free plan, free facade, long open window, and it has a roof garden, right? A fifth facade. In fact, the whole building is elevated above ground, which also represents Le Corbusier's utopian ideal. So Le Corbusier believed that a city should be a huge park. All the ground floor should be free, should be open space for people to roam, for people to freely move from one spot to another. It's just the whole city should be a big garden, and all those buildings need to be elevated above piers, so only occupy those space in air. So the ground should all be freed for recreation activity. So this entire building is a huge building, is elevated, and raised on a park-like site. The design is very complicated, actually. For example, in the section, you might notice each home occupies 2 floors. So this belongs to one family, and that belongs to another family. So it's not a simple design at all. The facade, modern architecture, the facade might be simple, but the interior is much more complicated than neoclassical architecture. So there are different floor negotiation, and here you have a balcony overlooking the living room. So imagine that space, you sit here and you can see the activity in the living room, and in the living room you have a tall floor and you can have visual communication with upstairs. So the interior is quite complicated, which is another philosophy Le Corbusier promoted. That is his motto, that architecture is the machine for living, right? A machine for living means its interior is complicated, right? It's not just a big sculpture. So the floor is elevated, so the entire ground is liberated. So he also used just undecorated concrete, which eventually became known as Beton brut. Beton brut means, concrete, it's honest expression of the material concrete. You don't need to hide it. You don't need to decorate it. You don't need to dress it up with marble or tile. So the pure concrete should find its own appropriate expression in architectural form. And that style became known as brutalist, right? The brutal, because the people at first thought it was brutal. So brutalism and eventually became very influential in the 1950s and 1960s. The new Boston City Hall is designed in the kind of brutalist style, and also using Beton brut that use the pure concrete for exterior expression. Le Corbusier's post-war design also went to a more kind of expressionist direction, and instead of doing his early career, what he promoted as those principles in architecture, he started to explore a more kind of psychological aspect of architectural form and space, like in his Ronshan Chapel, and which is kind of more organic in shape. It's like a sculpture. Instead of straight line, he used a lot of curve, and there is a lot of symbolism, and people can recognize something symbolically in the architectural form. Some said it is a praying hand. Someone says it is like the hat of a priest in a church, etc. and etc. So here he explored some kind of a light effect, like what we have seen in the Baroque architecture. So the light had been explored to create those religious interior atmosphere, very small windows, which allow light to enter. And there is also a linear light, the separation of the roof from the wall. So you can still tell that the supporting system and the enclosing systems are separate, because the roof does not rely on that wall at all. So he left a space there to allow the light to enter. But here, he manipulated those modern material for some religious expression. He also designed the capital city for the state of Chandigarh in India. And there he also used the Beton brut they use concrete. Right? Concrete is Le Corbusier's favorite architectural material, and that it was continued to be explored by later generation architects like Louis Kahn, who designed the Bangladesh capital city at Dhaka using pretty much the same style. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Yeah, here we have Louis Kahn also explore the potential of pure concrete in this Phillips Exeter library, which is not very far from here. So the interior, he used combined concrete and wood, creating this great material contrast and juxtaposition. Again, from outside, it looks quite simplistic, but then the interior had a great, powerful form that combined simplicity with symbolism. So here we find those circle and a square, and the contrast between the warm wooden surface with the cold, concrete surface. And this is his National Assembly in Dhaka, the capital for Bangladesh. And in addition to concrete, he also used brick, and he used brick for great, architectural expression. He used very simplistic geometric shape, but explore the texture and the surface to achieve richness in architectural expression. There are another direction in post-war that is aimed for creating flexibility in architecture, adopting the industrial line method for construction and housing, like this one by Moshe Safdie. So he called this habitat, and each housing unit was like is a module that can be fixed and added to the structure. So the structure was meant to be able to adjust it. So if you want, you can add more unit to it. And the framework for each module would allow that to be realized, right? So they have a structural integrity that allow them to self-sustain themselves, so that they can be piled up one on top of the other. So the general shape of the complex could be changed. So that was the ideal. Although in fact, after its construction, no new element were added. It remained like that, but that was the original idea, that to allow flexibility for architecture. In another word, architecture was completed, but it is not necessarily staying like that forever. It can be adjusted, it can be added, it can be repaired, it can be accumulated further. Mies van der Rohe continued his exploration in glass and metal. So he was the father of those glass high-rise. And he also designed the entire campus of the IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, right? So here, the whole campus is designed in the mission style, all just glass and metal. So it needs a lot of curtain because to control the sunshine though, right? So the curtain and the blind is very important, but they provide those flexibility to open the entire interior and to have a fuller connection visually between interior and exterior. So today, something like this looks so commonplace, and the reason is because the success of Mies van der Rohe. His design of the Lakeshore Drive apartment was so successful that eventually it was commercialized, and famous building firms like the SOM, KPF helped to popularize something like this throughout the world. So today it became the iconic image of modernism, and wherever you go to Shanghai, you go to Kuala Lumpur, you go to New Delhi, London, you see this glass box high-rise everywhere. And that is because of its efficiency and its economy that helped to popularize such a style. So Lakeshore Drive is the early example that was, right after the war, right? But today it's everywhere. Right? So the Seagram building in New York is a classic mission style glass box high-rise. And here in Boston, the Hancock by the Pei company, IM Pei company. So their floors are standardized for these high-rise glass box. The design is also mostly structural. The architectural space was relatively simple. So the space were organized around the elevator core. So you have an elevator, and then the other rooms can be freely divided into different functions. And very often the ground floor is opened to allow some nature incorporating into the architectural space. Yeah. So the glass curtain wall, right? Glass curtain wall. That separation of the frame structure from the enclosing elements pioneered by the Chicago School bear full fruit in the glass high-rise building. So SOM helped to popularize this one because SOM is a big company. It has branches all over the world. So glass box, like in the mission style, start to appear. And today, everywhere in the global cities, and today it became something celebrated as well as being criticized when people talk about modern architecture. Right, so this is just another example. So that popularization of modern style quickly in the 1950s and the 1960s triggered reaction. Just like the popularization of domination of anything, it triggered the opposite. It triggered opposition. And that opposition is called postmodernism. Postmodern architecture starts to appear in the late 60s, and in the 70s and 80s, it orchestrated a full battle against classic modernism, characterized by those monotonous glass box and a square concrete shape. Right? There were even declaration of the end of modernism. the famous postmodern architectural theorist Charles Jenkins claimed that modernism ended at a specific day when a modern building was bombed, was controlled bombed on a certain day, that day, 1970 something. And so he declared that was the failure of modernism because it is creating a flat world that is disregarding specific culture and specific location. A powerful criticism to modern movement was provided or heralded by Jean Jacobs' book called The Death and the Life of Great American Cities. So that book was published in 1961. In that book, Jacobs criticized the modernist attitude toward the old city. She said that when modernists came to modernize a city, they simply erase all those historical layers and replace them with those boring, monotonous, uniform kind of a glass box or concrete box, right? So he said, in fact, that was not good for community building because traditional old city, with their chaos, with their complexity, they actually provide safety. So Jacobs actually celebrate this kind of chaotic activity on the street. He believed that instead of dividing the city into different zones, this zone is for commercial, that zone for residential, it is better to be like old city where commercial shops are mixed with residential neighborhoods, where the street is not just a communication venue, but also a playground, but also a place for commercial activity. So he celebrated this hybridity and criticized the purity as kind of a sponsored by those classic modernist masters. So she said, you can neither lie to a neighborhood park nor reason with it. Artists' conceptions and persuasive renderings can put picture of life into proposed neighborhood parks or park malls, and verbal rationalizations can conjure up users who ought to appreciate them, but in real life, only diverse surroundings have the practical power of inducing a natural continuing flow of life and use. So here she was criticizing the utopian idea in modernism. I briefly introduced utopia. To some extent, the Renaissance utopian idea was fully implemented in modernism, in that a whole city, as if a whole city can be controlled by planning. So that, some example include Le Corbusier's design of Chandigarh in India, or Louis Kahn's design of the National Assembly in Dhaka, or the design of the Brazilian capital of Brasilia. But for Jacobs, those were failures. Those created that city. The separation of function, the clear-cut zoning in those artificially designed city never truly work. They didn't have life, and the actual city characterized by historical layers are better for life. And she also made an argument that they are safer than those totally controlled planned city. Another very powerful voice of postmodernism is Robert Venturi. So, and Denise Scott Brown, Venturi published The Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, in which he celebrated complexity, he celebrated chaos, he celebrated hybridity, and he criticized the clarity and rationalism and the total planning, those utopian idea in modernism. And another publication, Learning from Las Vegas, he celebrated Las Vegas, its contradiction, its complexity, its chaos, and its hybridity. He celebrated all those as good thing. And he used this image by Michelangelo on the cover. This is a kind of a mannerist work by Michelangelo. It is not pure. It is exactly something criticized by Laugier, Antoine Laugier, for dissecting classical form and irrational piling up gables, etc. But now, after modernism, in postmodernism, those values came back. So we see that kind of back and forth and struggle. So complexity and contradiction now in postmodernism were celebrated. So the motto for Mies van der Rohe and modernism is less is more. And Venturi replaced that with less is more, right? So this is modern, and postmodern would say no to this. Actually, they believe those neoclassical, Baroque, seemingly irrational decoration, all those criticized by modernism are good, because now it is not efficiency that is the priority. Efficiency create those boring things, right? So when it is popularized throughout the world, it is boring. This is the point made by postmodernism. So these start to celebrate these once again. So in architecture, we see what the postmodern like. We don't have much time, so I'm going to go very quickly. Las Vegas, all those copies, right? So this is certainly not original. These are not genius, not created by great masters, but they are interesting. That's the point Venturi was raising. They are interesting. They might not be that avant-garde, but they are not as boring as a glass box. And in his own design, of course, he is not going back to Baroque. This is the Venturi's design, but you can see it is not the classic modernist work. Here he had gable and it's broken, but in the modern kind of a simplistic form, a broken gable. It has extra decoration. Not all the forms had a structural reason. For example, this arch is a decoration, right? So he is making a point here. There are a lot of contradiction, like a stair leading to nowhere, and then there's a wall behind this window, right? Seems irrational, but he was making a statement by doing this. He tried to point out that architecture, interest is a very important element of architecture, communicating meaning related to people's life, telling a story. These are just as important as efficiency and functionality. So for Venturi, architecture is not just a machine for living. It's not just a machine for living. Architecture as a machine for living is boring. So another postmodern architecture, and you can see all those anti-classic modernist gesture, using a lot of classical quotation, right? Communicating meaning. In the pool, he delineated a map of Italy using those steps. So there's a story behind architecture, not just efficiency and functionality. A high-rise building designed by Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson started as a pure modernist architect. He worked with Mies van der Rohe, but his later work, he put artificial decoration, right? And he had those tripartite division on the facade that refer to those early Chicago style before modernism. And Michael Graves designed these postmodernist work, right? Use a lot of color and use sculpture. All those would be criticized by Mies or Gropius. But it's fun. And it is also meaningful. It creates a landmark. It creates a spot of interest that people can point to. And that is also significant in architecture. So he used a lot of simplified classical motif, artificial decoration, color. So honest to material is no longer that important. So he used a lot of paint on architecture as well. So that's postmodern, right? Another direction of postmodern is high tech. So this one, the Pompidou Center by Rogers and Piano. So the high tech image created by turning all those interior tubes and drainage and cables to the exterior, right? As if now the gut and the intestines are all turned to the surface. So we call it high tech because it looks like some kind of a high technology machinery. Hybridity, quotation of historical element can also be observed in the German architect James Stirling. So the space remind us those Roman ruins and some classical architectural form as well. And although he is using kind of a modern composition, and this especially remind us the classical Pantheon or the Colosseum. And it also remind us the Arte Museum by Schinkel. So historicism was brought back, right? Just to remind you, Schinkel's Arte Museum is a rotunda in the center. And here it was replaced by a circular kind of a platform. Historicism brought back and continued in the 1980s, like this by Monet, a museum, but using those Roman arches. So there is also a criticism to modernism for neglecting regional differences. So there's a movement called the critical regionalism, who try to find local spirit, use local material, and use local tradition to define a specific spirit for a specific location, to counterfight the modernist kind of a internationalist attitude for the built environment. And critical regionalism can also be observed in the Japanese architect like Tadao Ando, whose architecture using beton brut, using pure concrete, but had a strong Zen flavor, like those Zen garden. The minimalist attitude to architecture was combined with the traditional Japanese Zen philosophy and aesthetics. Local material of wood was revived, and historical city was preserved, was proposed to be preserved as much as possible, instead of being replaced by modernist flat. Right? Colin Rowe was a big voice behind that historical preservationist attitude to architecture. And there were kind of new avant-garde who manipulate architectural form, creating those accidental spaces, and like Peter Eisenman. So some of them are referred to as deconstructionist, like Frank Gehry, who really created new architectural image of chaos and order that kind of deconstruct our imagination about architecture as well. His own house and his famous Bilbao museum in Spain. And manipulation of form, playful overlapping of architectural element is another direction in the postmodern kind of avant-garde, like these kind of deconstructionist attitude to architecture. So here, a traditional building is combined, overlapped with a new glass, kind of a, so architecture was analyzed and free recomposed in a new, seemingly accidental, but nonetheless innovative way, create those surprise and excitement in architecture. This is a building by Lieberskind, the Jewish museum in Berlin. Very interesting building. And just show you some kind of postmodern attitude to architecture. So it's a postmodern world is characterized by globalization, by kind of a differentiation and kind of enrichment, and celebration of multitude gesture to architecture instead of singularizing one voice. And in that sense, it is kind of similar to what happened after historical revival, when all those historical forms can be quoted and freely used. But now it is on a much greater scale and much more open for whatever possibility for architecture. All right,